Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Valerie Lyons. As you may know from my accent, I'm from Ireland. And I think most of you have probably never heard me speak before because most of the speaking I've done has been mainly in Europe. So it's my first time in RSA, and it's my first time to speak at RSA. So I've got two things to deal with. But what I really wanted to do was to kind of give you a sense of me, introduce us, and I thought, I could just give you a quick lowdown of my bio, or else I could give you an analogy of my bio, which is my bio through boyfriends. And I started off in IBM when I was 20 years old. I won a scholarship to be an intern there for a year, so that was my sort of young love. And I did a little bit of learning in that. But then I moved on to my next boyfriend. My next boyfriend was computer programming. And that was a really toxic relationship. So it didn't work out for either of us, and we said we never wanted to see each other again. So then I moved on, and I found cybersecurity. So we met 3 decades ago. And we were with each other for 2 decades. For 15 years, I was CISO in KBC Bank. And even though it was a good relationship, it was kind of boring, and I didn't feel fulfilled. And one day, I met privacy. It was love at first sight. And so I left cybersecurity. Broken-hearted, I know, but I left cybersecurity, and I'm still good friends with cybersecurity, so we stayed friends. But we see each other from time to time. But my one true love is privacy. So we decided to formalize it, and I did a PhD in privacy, and we're going to extend our family into a book at the end of this year. So that's my quick bio through boyfriends. My PhD is in privacy as a CSR and privacy as an ESG. I believe that privacy should not be seen as a baseline of compliance, and that's all that we ever talk about is GDPR and CPRA. I believe that privacy should be well beyond that. So my dissertation was called Doing Privacy Right, Not Rights. And I tried to bring that to my presentations. So if anybody is expecting a diatribe here today on GDPR and CPRA or CCPA, I'm sorry to disappoint, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about. But what I really, really want is if I can get you to see privacy, the one that I fell in love with, the one that I am crazy about, if I can get you to see that, then my job is done. So I hope that's the one thing I really hope to give you today is a sense of privacy beyond compliance, a sense of privacy as humans. So that's my bio, disclaimer. And then the inner academic in me always has to get the definitions right. And we have a problem right now in that there's a room full of people, and some of you are from the US and some of you are from the EU. And actually, we talk different languages, even though we don't think we do, because we started to use these terms interchangeably. So privacy, information privacy, data privacy, all these different terms, in the US, it means different things than in the EU. And so it's created a problem, and I just want to clear those things up so that we all understand what I'm talking about when we go through the rest of the presentation. So the confusion comes essentially from what do I mean by privacy. The EU has a definition for data protection, and that is defined as the protection of personal data, keeping data safe. That's what we call data protection. That's why we have in the EU International Data Protection Day on the 28th of January to celebrate the signing of Convention 108. So that's the name that we give it. But we also have General Data Protection Regulation. So it's data protection again. See the trend? Data privacy means empowering users, okay, so that they can control what they share with other people. So that essentially is data rights, data subject rights. And that's what we call data privacy. And then we have privacy. Now, the word privacy does not mean data protection. Privacy is something enshrined, a human right. It's enshrined in the Human Rights Convention. Essentially, it's Warren and Brandeis's 1890 paper translated into law today. It is the right to be let alone. So privacy includes, I don't want drones over my back garden. That's privacy. I want a door on the toilet. That's privacy. But it's not data protection. Data protection is a subset of privacy. Then, that's in the EU. Now we can move to the US. In the US, data protection, remember what data protection was in the EU? Data protection is actually the process and controls in place to protect all data, including personally identifiable information, and corporate data and systems data. So that's the NIST definition. Data privacy is defined as the obligations of an organization to protect PI. And that's why, if you can think about it, it's the same as data protection in the US or in the EU. So that's why you've got Data Privacy Day on the 28th of January, same as Data Protection Day in Europe, celebrating the same thing, the signing of Convention 108, but here in the US you call it Data Privacy Day. And that's why you call it the California Consumer Privacy Act, because if it was in Europe, you call it the California Consumer Data Protection Act. Okay, so we're going to use the US context for the rest of this discussion, but it's just for those in the audience who are from the EU, just so you understand why we'll be using the US. So, we do see, sorry, I beg your pardon, we do see a small change here, which if anybody remembers the bill from last year, the one that maybe will go through, who knows when, but it was called the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. And I think this is like going to try and piece together the bit of a gap that we have between the two contexts. So hybrid workforce. A quickie on hybrid workforce. There's just different types, okay? So it's like a continuum. We have a scale that goes from one to the other. Fully on-site, we all know what that is, to fully remote, we all know what that is. And in between, there's variations and different terminology used to describe those variations. But essentially, it can be either your organization tells you what days you are able to work from home, or you decide. So that's a more flexible arrangement. So you've got flexible hybrid, fixed hybrid, which is you decide set days, and then office-first hybrid, where the organization decides who works what days from home. So it's an interesting report from McKinsey, where they asked a number of C-suite executives, do you have a hybrid workforce plan? And you can see there that almost 70% said that they didn't. Now, that might seem high. I think it does seem high, but it's understandable because remember, I think it's the wrong question that they're asking. The question to be asked is, what made you move into a hybrid workforce? And for most of us, let's be honest, we know what happened. And this is what happened, and we moved to a hybrid workforce. We were remote first, and we did so in a bit of a rush. For most organizations, I heard a story this morning about somebody traveling the US with a hire van so that they could collect 1,100 laptops from the other side of the US because they couldn't get them ordered. We were all panicked at the time. So it's understandable that these things did not get addressed. But we're now substantially out of that sort of quagmire, and we should be looking back more introspectively saying, what did we miss when we did that? So this is what we expected to see. We expected to see work from home that looked like this, but unfortunately it looked more like this. And the reason was we were homeschooling. Will you ever forget it? We were homeschooling. We had two parents at home. We had kids at home, teenagers at home. We had students in university at home. The average house size, so just people understand, maybe the EU versus the US, the average house size in Ireland is somewhere between 800 square feet and 900 square feet. There is not any room for two separate offices. So people were working like this frequently. I happened to be lucky when we hit the pandemic that I did have a home office because I was doing a PhD, so I needed one. But most of my colleagues didn't. So moving beyond the pandemic, let's just take a look at what actually happened. Not just the working from home piece and that big panic, but there was also something else happened. We had KPMG in 2020, they did a report, and they said it was 72% increase in ransomware. Now, they said they couldn't tell if it was a 72% increase in ransomware or 72% increase in people being susceptible to ransomware, but they thought the latter. On the basis of the fact people were now isolated, they weren't able to lean back and say to their workmates, listen, what do you think of this email? You know, they didn't have those conversations. So we saw a 72% increase in ransomware. We also saw a whole new talent pool. Who recruited from outside of the standard jurisdiction that they recruited from? Because you could now take remote employees. We opened up to our staff moving to different locations, and we recruited from different locations that we never recruited from before. But did we check what the implications of that new recruitment might be? Boundaries were blurred. We had very clear boundaries on, not going back to the boyfriend analogy, but we had very clear boundaries on our networks. And suddenly we found ourselves dealing with people working from home who traditionally hadn't, and access to emails that maybe weren't so securely configured. We also had a new workplace involved. Did we audit it? And that was the working from home environment, the home office. And if we recruited new people, we also had a whole new series of legislation. For instance, if you recruited somebody from Ireland, you'd need to be thinking about their Health and Safety in the Workplace Act, because you would have to comply with that. So you had a whole series of new legislation that you needed to incorporate, but did you actually do that work? Most likely not, because we all responded in a rush, in a panic, and we just had to get back up and running again. And that's perfectly okay. No judgment on this stage, but probably now's the time to be more introspective and look back. So let's take a quick look at what those controls looked like before we rushed to remote. Typical stuff. We know we had physical security, clean desk policies. This is, Mother Nature to most cybersecurity people in the room. We had VPNs, we had firewalls, and we had maybe 5% of our workforce working remotely. It's an interesting study that was done that said we were at 4%, in fact, remotely. It's done by Gartner in 2022. 4% of us worked remotely in 2019. And then at the peak of the pandemic, 66% of us worked remotely. And then last year in 2022, it had dropped to 27, and it was expected to level out at 25%. Now, there's 100 other statistics out there that will give you a range of who's working remotely, but I just took the one from Gartner, and I think it's probably most accurate. We also had monitoring of employees. We monitored a lot of traffic. We monitored internet access. We monitored emails. We also had obligations under GDPR, so here comes the GDPR and the CCPA bit, but we did have obligations before the pandemic. So we did have obligations before we moved to these remote working environments. So we had data subject rights. Now, they were already in play in GDPR, so they're coming into effect now at CPRA. But we had data subject rights, and this is a really interesting one because we never thought about the fact that if we had subject access requests, where was the data? We knew where it was before, but now it was everywhere. It was on people's laptops. It was in their email accounts. So we never updated the SARs, the subject access request processes. So we also had, we have requirements to ensure the security over the data is appropriate, and we had changed technologies. Many of us were using technologies now that we hadn't previously. And the requirement to do a data protection impact assessment under GDPR also hadn't been conducted. For some organizations, we had requirements to conduct what are called ROPA, Records of Processing Activities. Now, under GDPR, ROPAs are only for organizations 250 employees or more. But really, doing privacy right means you should have ROPAs in place, whether or not the law says so. Data maps are another word that's often used to describe them, but they should have been in place and they should have been updated after we had the remote work environment. Data protection impact assessments are living documents. They are constantly being updated. We didn't update our data protection impact assessments because it's a big job for many organizations, and we didn't go back to them to update them to reflect that our data subjects, the employees, there was an increased risk to their data. And then we had training. Anybody tried training online using Zoom? It was very ineffective. So we needed to update those training policies. So what are the challenges? Let's go through some of those challenges. There's 10 key challenges, just to let you know. There's 8 challenges as such, 1 observation, and then one of the challenges is more of a stress than it is a challenge. So the first challenge is the skill set required. So this morning we were talking at another session about the data-aware CISO, the privacy-aware CISO. So we have cybersecurity people who need to be much more aware of data privacy requirements. And we have privacy people who need to be much more aware of cybersecurity requirements. Have you ever noticed that privacy people talk in articles, regulations, derogations, recitals? This is the language of the privacy professional. Cybersecurity people talk in VPNs, they talk in firewalls. It's a totally different language. And so the skill set that's required, we now need to consider learning a new skill set or finding a language that we both understand. And so there's 2 options. So we can, the reason I say this is because this is a report here from Okta. It was actually done by Statista. So it was a really robust report across Europe, and they asked what were the top 5 challenges to a number of C-suite executives. And their top was improving cybersecurity. And my issue with this is really, is it not improving compliance to privacy? Cybersecurity is helping that challenge. Cybersecurity is facilitating that challenge, but the compliance piece is really privacy. But we see this all the time, that intersection between privacy and cybersecurity. And so privacy professionals need to learn the language of cybersecurity. So you can collaborate with the CISO, with the business continuity management. You can collaborate with a number of different groups. That's one way to do it. You can leverage privacy by design mandate, because if you have a GDPR requirement, and if you're mandated by GDPR, you can use those privacy by design mandates within GDPR to leverage further resource. And that's something that we often find ourselves doing now in the EU, is using those privacy by design mandates. If you're if you have me, like me, for instance, I'm CISSP, and I also am CDPSE, and I'm studying for CIPP. So it's try to get certifications in both cybersecurity and privacy. But this is the most important one, I think, as a solution to the challenge, is find a framework that actually speaks both languages. So NIST speaks both languages. They have a framework that is a cybersecurity framework, and they have a similar framework for the privacy side. ISO 27001 has an extension, which is 701 for the privacy side. So then you find that you're going to be talking the same language throughout your organization. It's something to think about. And then cross-training and skills program. Okay, so privacy challenge number 2 and 3 I've bunged together. So the transmitting or processing of personal data outside the organization, and discussing of sensitive information outside of the organization or outside of the typical rules that we had in place. Now, this is a problem that even the largest administrations have struggled with, is sending work home. Okay, so we've had that right throughout the pandemic, and we've had it since. But people sending work home, people taking work outside and circumventing the rules that we had in place within our organization. But during the pandemic, we understood it because it needed to be done. But are you aware if somebody is taking work outside and circumventing the policies that you have in place? So what can you do with this one? Well, you can introduce penalties. Now, I'm not a fond lover of penalties, but if you're going to have policies that say thou shalt not do this, I think you need to introduce penalties. And the best penalty for that is to introduce something in performance management side of things to say, look, if you do this, there will be a penalty and it will come through on your bonus, but that you introduce some kind of penalties. You should have these things in place. They're very, very basic, but to actually take a look and see if they're reflected now in your home environment. So do you have data loss prevention tools implemented that include those home environments? Do you have email monitoring, data filtering? Do you have these things in place? And employee surveillance, okay, do we have employees surveillance? Of course we have employee surveillance. But when we look to extend to a new talent pool, we then recruited new people. Those new people, you may not be allowed to have the same surveillance mechanisms on those people as you do others. We're very, very strict about employee surveillance in Europe, and there's a reason for it, okay? So data protection impact assessments are tools that identify risk to the data subject. That's essentially what they're trying to do, is to identify risk to the data subject. So when you have an employee who's being monitored, you might say, well, you know, I got their consent. But there's an imbalance of power in that consent, and GDPR recognizes the imbalance of power, and it categorizes that data as special category data because of the imbalance of power. It does the same with vulnerable individuals. It does the same in the context of, say, refugees and government agencies. So it recognizes that there's an imbalance in power. So you might say, well, I'm not actually processing data that's sensitive data, but actually, as it turns out, you're processing special category data because of that imbalance of power. So you have to be really careful if you're processing employees' data for the purpose of monitoring in the EU context. Records of processing activities. We now had data that has moved to different locations on people's laptops. It moved out to the cloud. It's moved to different locations, so we needed to update the records of processing activities. And then the SARs. You need to go and revisit those SARs, those subject access request processes, and make sure that they're now up to date where the data actually resides. Okay, challenge number 4, mobile device strategy. So those of you of a particular vintage, like me, would remember the bring your own device, or as it was called back then, bring your own data breach. But there was 2, really, bring your own device and choose your own device. And they were the only 2 that were available. Now we have a whole series of acronyms, corporate owned, personally enabled. In other words, you have some personal use on that device. And then corporate only, business only, corporate owned, business only. There's lots of these different types of strategies that we can have. The most important thing is that you do have a strategy, that you recognize if you have visibility and oversight of how many devices do you have in the organization, the applications running on those devices, accessibility of endpoints. So this is mother's milk is what we call it, mother's milk to cybersecurity people, but maybe not so to privacy people. So some suggested solutions on this is revise your mobile device strategy and update to reflect hybrid work. And you most likely have many of these tools in place, mobile device management tools. If you don't, you need them. Okay, you cannot have remote work. You cannot have hybrid work. Under GDPR, it says you must have the appropriate technical tools in place, the measures that you have in place. MDM would be the expected minimum to have in place if you're going to have people working from home. And of course, you have to have multi-factor authentication on all your SaaS and cloud apps. So that's at a minimum. And now, number 5, challenge number 5 is my favorite, because this is where you get to see beyond the compliance piece. This is where we get to talk about people and privacy. So we had new employees, didn't we? Many of us recruited people during the pandemic. We never saw them, we never met them, we recruited them online. They worked for us online, they were remote. They were from different jurisdictions, different states, different countries. So we had all these individuals now processing data in a different territory. So we were transferring data essentially from one state to another, but we didn't anticipate what the transfer implications would be, bearing in mind that if in the EU, if we recruited somebody who was from the US, we were now transferring to a country that didn't have a structure in place for us to do the transfer because it was outside of the EU. So we needed adequacy decisions. We don't want to talk about Schrems, but that's essentially the problem we would have faced. But there's more to people and privacy than just the legislation. When we recruit from different countries, we actually recruit from different cultures. And we have different expectations towards privacy and different behaviors towards privacy. So for instance, a very simple example is in China. In China, they have the Great Firewall of China. There's absolutely zero expectation of privacy while you're on the internet or in your emails. It doesn't exist. But they do have huge regard for organizations processing their data, and they have huge expectations for data protection from organizations. But just in terms of government surveillance, they don't have any protection for government surveillance. In Japan, private key is the Japanese word for privacy, and it was only introduced about 10 years ago. They didn't actually have a word for it, and it really translates to secret. That's what it translates to. And it has a context of shame associated with it. So, you get a sense of if you're going to be recruiting somebody, then culturally they may have a different perspective on privacy than other countries. But there's many aspects to privacy, the factors that influence those behaviors. So one of them would be legislation. I have an expectation that when my card is scanned, when I'm at RSA, that somebody is going to tell me why they're scanning my card. But that doesn't exist here. It only exists in the EU. Nobody here is saying, well, what is the purpose of you scanning my card? We all know, but you have to say it in Europe. So legislation affects my expectations and consequently my behaviors. This one is a really, really interesting one. This is a study done by Annenberg. You might fix my pronunciation. Annenberg School for Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. They looked at the political orientation of thousands of individuals and found that Democrats and Republicans had a hugely different response, acceptance, to the invasion of privacy by the state, so government surveillance, in the name of national security. And Republicans were more comfortable with it and therefore had lesser negative response behaviors than Democrats. Now, that's their study. They did a Democrats versus Republican study, but you could take that study essentially and you could apply it to almost any country, anywhere, and I'm sure you'll find left and rights in a similar position. But political orientation affects how we feel and behave in terms of privacy. There is another piece of privacy called propensity towards privacy. It's a scale, and that's the science of it. It's 4 questions that you can ask in a survey, and you can figure out if somebody has a low propensity towards privacy or a high propensity towards privacy. And what it translates to is, that thing where you say about people, they're a very private person. A high propensity towards privacy is a very private person. And very private people have got very good privacy protection behaviors. So some people in the community have very high protection. Some people, like me, I scale low, believe it or not, with a PhD in privacy. I will sing like a canary. If anybody wants to know about my life, I'll just talk to them and I'll tell everything. So I'm not a very private person, but I scale low on the propensity towards privacy scale. Age. Age is a really interesting, because our workforce is made up of so many generations now. Age is a really interesting influence on privacy. So down one end of the scale, we've got the 18 to 25-year-olds. Studies have shown us that in 18 to 25, they will trade their privacy. They will sell their soul to look cool on social media. They will sell their soul for sociability. That is what they will do. So they're willing to trade their privacy, but they need to get something in return for it. Now, if you have 18 to 25-year-olds working in your organization, or you didn't recruit them before, but you do now, maybe you need to think about the fact that their privacy responses are going to be different than the cultural ones you had in the organization already. Down the other end of the scale, the boomers rip up receipts before they put them in the bin. The boomers will not give away their privacy at all, and they're very protective of it. So they have very strong privacy protection behaviors. But they also don't have really strong technical understanding of how to protect their privacy. And then we have the cohort in the middle. So in the 40 to 50 age range, anybody want to guess what they'll sell their soul for? What was that? Money. You're very close, absolutely. A 10% discount or a loyalty card, absolutely. So money, and that's so once you know these things, once you know that that's how people trade their privacy, now you can understand the people in your organization and maybe the implications of recruiting new people to your organization. Gender is another influence. So we know that, for instance, men are much more private about their home life than their work life. And women are much more private about their work life than their home life. So what implications does that have for your organization? And then finally, it's an interesting one, but your socioeconomic status also has an influence on your privacy behaviors and your privacy expectations. So we know that the poorer countries, if you take a selection of maybe a number of East African countries, they don't have a regard for privacy, yours or theirs, because food is what's a necessity there. So privacy really isn't either an expectation or a desire, because you have other Maslow hierarchy of needs requirements. Now that is an absolute whistle-stop tour of why I fell in love with privacy, but you can see that it's not all about regulation. There's actually a human element to privacy and understanding the people who work in your organization. So some suggested solutions is make sure that you look at the legislation that applies to people and ask yourself, have I reflected that in the policies, the cultural regard? Have I reflected that in my policies? And you need to think, are transfer impact assessments required if we're transmitting data outside of the EU or transmitting it to other countries? TIAs are data protection impact assessments done for transfers. And then you have to do continuous training to align the culture so that people can become more aligned with the culture that you had already established in your organization. In highly confidential contexts, so we'll say, for instance, in the US, in organizations like the FBI or the CIA or those agencies who require a lot of confidentiality with the data that they process, those organizations should be considering assessing people's capacity for privacy, concern, and propensity towards privacy, and not recruit people like me who don't have a high propensity towards privacy. And there's a number of different scales, and there's privacy concern scales, there's privacy risk perception scales. There's a lot of different scales out there that you can use and incorporate them into surveys, candidate surveys. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through this. This is call recordings. Did anybody anticipate that call recordings were going to be a problem pre-pandemic? I'm just going to give you a little story. Probably it's not going to paint me in the best of light, but during the pandemic, we all had flights, didn't we? And we tried to get our money back from those airlines, and they weren't giving the money back. So what I did was I made a number of calls to the airline, and I knew that the airline wasn't going to be recording those calls because they hadn't set up quick enough to route the calls through the call recording system. But at the beginning of the call, they still told me that they were recording the call, but somebody in a house on a mobile phone was being routed to the call and taking my details. So I made a request under GDPR for a copy of that call. If the call doesn't exist, then there's a breach of GDPR. And so they had breached GDPR. Now, I could not get my money from this airline, but when they breached GDPR, I said to them, well, I won't make a complaint to the Data Protection Commissioner if you just give me my money. So I got my money. And I kept my word. But the reality was it happened to multiple organizations that we were just moving really, really quickly, but we needed to get up and running as quickly as possible. And we missed this trick, that call recordings didn't get done when they got transferred to these mobile phones in people's homes. But another thing I heard recently was somebody had let somebody go, and their child, their 13-year-old child, had heard the entire conversation. So we were now having these private conversations at home amongst families, and they were really delicate conversations, but they were completely inappropriate to have in those contexts. And there's just some interesting numbers here. That this is from Gartner, that by 2025, 75% of customer conversations will be recorded. So have you got those calls recorded? Because under GDPR, they're included in a subject access request. And you need to be able to respond quickly and easily and within 30 days and give people access to those calls.
How is it different from call transcripts,
Yeah, and so the transcripts are important, but the actual call under GDPR, my voice is my data. So if you say to me, I record this call, then I have a right to make a request for that call. And so you can have the transcripts, but if I want the call, I'm entitled to it under GDPR, which is interesting because it's my data.
Can you ask that recording to be deleted?
Absolutely.
Even a conference call with like 10 people in there.
It's really difficult to do, so you have to balance the requirement. But yeah, it is very difficult to do, but you can ask for it to be deleted. You can't take yourself out of a discussion, but you will always find that on Zoom and things like that, people will say, is it okay if we record? Does anyone have an objection? Okay, challenge number 6. So determine the gap between the call recording requirements. That means going back and taking a look at what actually should be happening versus what actually is happening. Look and update your DPIAs and your ROPAs. It's almost every single one is the same, DPIAs and ROPAs. Make sure you update those DPIAs and ROPAs. And test those recording mechanisms. We forgot to test them to see do they work in the mobile world. And these are just ways you can go and test them. How can you respond to a SAR, for instance? How quick can you pull that data out of the recording system and respond to a SAR? People didn't test that. And so it's actually taking a substantial period of time to go and find the call recording and then get it back to the customer. So challenge number 7, VPNs. Does anybody know what this is? So it's the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. 3.5 million people go down one road, and essentially there's stampedes, and thousands of people have died over the years because it's a bottleneck. And they've tried lots of different things, but it is a huge problem. I'm sure it's a wonderful pilgrimage, but it's a huge problem. And VPNs, it was exactly the same. During the pandemic, we all moved to our remote homes, and we tried to get in to the networks through the VPNs all at the same time. And we all know what happened, productivity issues and efficiency issues on our VPNs. So now, you know there's that phrase, if you torture the data long enough, it will tell you anything. So when we see reports that give us statistics, I always look at them. I take academic numbers and studies, absolute. But when I look at reports, industry reports, you know, I use them as a guide, but I never take them 100%. So this is from HP, securing the hybrid workplace. But they have a solution in place for this, so it's in their best interest for the numbers to kind of fit with their requirement. But at the same time, it's an interesting report. They say 41% of respondents rely on VPN technology, but that 75% of them said that the biggest issue for them was productivity and slow performance. So what can we do about this issue? Well, you can consider zero trust in remote desktop. I say that so easily, off the tip of my tongue, but we all know that that's a monster to implement, essentially removing implicit trust from the architecture of our networks. It is not easy, it is not straightforward. In that report, securing the hybrid workspace, of course, HP have a tool in this space. In that report, they say that only 2% had no plans to implement zero trust access. So 98% of the respondents in that report said that they were going to be implementing zero trust. Okay, key privacy challenge number 8 is monitoring. Now, we did touch on this. So monitoring employees, the legal basis for monitoring under GDPR, you have to have a legal basis in what's called Article 6 and a legal basis in Article 9 because they're special category data. And that means consent is going to be really, really difficult. And so you have to be really careful about what you do with employee monitoring when you're monitoring European employees. Because of the consent issues, the disparity in the principles in GDPR of necessity, proportionality. You know, are you bringing a tank to a gunfight? Are you monitoring too much? So you have to be really careful under GDPR when you're going to monitor European employees. A quick one on number 8. Cloud-based email. Don't forget, if you use cloud-based email, to implement multi-factor authentication. And then you have to make sure that you make clear all the security measures that you have in place and your storage limitation. How long are you going to hold the information that you've recorded on employees? It's really important that you delete the information if you say you're going to keep it only for 3 months. And then, of course, the issues with necessity and proportionality. So under GDPR, necessity is you have to be certain that there is no alternative. So if you're going to monitor employees, you have to be certain that there is no alternative. Now, the greatest way to do that is to find a piece of legislation, and health and safety in the workplace is one of those pieces of legislation. So that's typically the road we go down on necessity. And then challenge number 9 is that there's too many challenges. It's complex to deal with. And again, I'm going to show what should you do to deal with this. So this is, again, going to show my vintage. Not too many people probably know who this is. Does anyone know who this is? Oh, we have some. We know it's Tears of Rain. He's a clone, basically, in a really brilliant movie called Blade Runner, the first one. But he's a clone, and that's about as good as it gets. We have to clone ourselves if we want to be able to deal with all these challenges. And if that's not possible, we can also look to restructure the department. And I think that I'm seeing this very much in a lot of our bigger clients at the moment, where organizations are starting to bring privacy and cybersecurity together into one team. And it makes sense. Back to that point earlier about the talking and everybody talking the same language. Now, if they're in the same team, that's more likely to happen. And then virtual outsourced services. You can always get DPO as a service or CISO as a service. You can gain traction by extending there. And I know this might sound like flippant, but this is something I'm just going to share with you because I think it was just amazing. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you don't know it, you should take a look at it because it's called the Time Management Matrix. Anybody know the Time Management Matrix? It's awesome. It's just so good, and it's so simple. But if you're not in the urgent, important box, you don't get done. Not today, anyway. You might get done tomorrow. And if you use this time management matrix as a daily exercise, it's actually really interesting. But I know it's nothing to do with privacy, but I just thought I'd put it out there for you. And then final challenge is an observation. Privacy is an ESG. Just to let you know, if you can get privacy as an ESG, you will give yourself an opportunity to be heard and seen at a different level. C-suite executives will be reading the ESG report. ESG is quantitative, okay? CSR is qualitative. ESG is about numbers, and one of those numbers is E. Now, S, social, we know privacy can be a CSR, so that's the social piece, we know that. Governance, we all know about governance. But E, there's some tenuous links to environmental for privacy, and I haven't seen anything really good, but there is one coming. And this is just for anyone who works in a larger organization is there's a new EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And in that directive, you can look at how much your organization had in terms of their footprint, people coming to work, versus now. It's not possible to provide hybrid work without privacy and cybersecurity working together. It's simply not possible. So you can rob that as yours and get into the ESG report. And you can leverage that to increase your resources. So it's coming in 2024, and you have the potential to create an ESG for privacy if it does. And that's pretty much it. I'm conscious we need question time. How many minutes? 5 minutes? So we have 5 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to ask a question.
Thank you. You mentioned something that caught my attention about your voice, and I think EU considers that your right, your privacy. How is EU handling generative AI, where voices could be recreated by artificial intelligence, and what's the rights there, and is that still forming? I'm assuming with your PhD you probably are specializing or exploring that too.
So the data that's created, and I can give you a simple example, which is derived data. So if we just remove the AI from it, but just for a minute, that at the moment AI can create data. So for instance, it can see patterns. So you can create data that never belonged to me in the first place. Well, the EU doesn't agree. If you create data, and you infer it, inferential data, derived data, if you infer it or create it from anything, and it's about me, it's mine. That's what they've decided. So it doesn't matter if it's generative AI or any kind of AI, but if you're inferring data or creating data or copying data, it's still mine. The problem is I just don't know you have it. You know, you've created it, but you haven't told me that you have it. So maybe you know what my voting tendencies are, but you haven't told me. So I don't know that you have that information, but it's a great question.
Go back to reporting, because Microsoft, when you do a report, Teams reporting, after like 30 days to 60 days, it will expire. So if that expires, if one of our users is from EU countries and they request that reporting to be given to them, is there any expirations, or did the user has all the time they can to update?
No, it's in the policy. The policy says you only hold it for 60 days. It needs to be gone, and there's nothing they can do. So they have 60 days to ask for it, as long as it's clear in the policy. It's in the policy, yeah. Any other questions?
One of the things we do on the security side is we take in data from a million different sources, consolidate it, and analyze it. Once you've consolidated it, once you've analyzed it, it might take on a new purpose. And whether that's through threat intelligence, threat hunting, through responsiveness to legal, responsiveness to HR, how do you capture that in a privacy sense when the owners of the initial systems might have no idea you're doing it?
Yeah. So it's in different contexts. So under GDPR, you can process for a secondary purpose if it's related to the first. Okay? So it has to be related to the first. Now that word related is very vague, isn't it? So you know that that's going to be a potential for a bit of flexible interpretation. But you have the opportunity, but you can't do it for a secondary purpose if it's not related. You would have to go back and find a legal basis to do it for that purpose. And it may require consent.
So either account for those possible secondary purposes up front, or cascading paper trail on the back.
That's another way, yeah. But you can do it up front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great presentation, thank you. I work closely with our privacy team, and we are kind of embedded in the same group. But you know, as a privacy person at a cyber event, like, what do you think you would ask? You know, what's like your request to sort of somebody who's in a cybersecurity role that would like most help your privacy job?
Well, but I don't understand the question.
Well, sort of just like, what's something that, you know, as a cyber person working with our privacy team, like, what's a suggestion that we should all sort of think about and remember?
I would say you need to find a way, and I'm going to use the metaphor, but you need to find a way to get into bed together. Do you know what I mean? Metaphorically. And that knitting of the two, it's relationship building. It's saying things like, walk a week in my shoes. So, you know, I've recommended that to other organizations that I've worked with before, where I say that the CPO should walk a week in the CISO's shoes, and the CISO should walk a week in the CPO's shoes, just to know what their challenges are, because you actually can resolve their challenges. If they thought they understood what those challenges are. So walk a week in my shoes, or getting in bed together somehow, attending similar meetings, things like that.
Cool. Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you.
Well, we're done. Thank you.